So getting back to your email, what clues did you provide in your email that this was a parody, not intended to be taken seriously? And what was your actual intent in sending this email confession? What were you trying to achieve with this?
In the email, I say, this is just the politics of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If I had given credit to this man, I wouldn't have been able to lecture in conferences around the world. Now, no professor would ever say anything of the sort. No professor would say, it's true that I should have given credit to this man. But this is just the politics of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If I had given him credit, I wouldn't have been invited to give lectures around the world. No professor would ever say anything like that. That's a sign right there that it's a satire. That's one of the basic signs of a satire. When something is implausible, you know it's a satire. So you're telling me that this is an impersonation and not a satire? Nonsense. Impersonation, incidentally, is a basic element of parody, which is satirical imitation. There's always impersonation in parody. So what we've gotten used to is people going on television and impersonating somebody. You know it's an impersonation, right? When you're talking about a text, a written parody on a piece of paper or in an email, then it's a little more, it takes a little more reflection, a little more thought. Obviously, you're reading something, you have to think about it. So have we reached the point in the United States where we're so insensitive to irony that we can't spot a parody? How has this happened? How can this happen? This is really an outrage. So incidentally, politicians do this all the time. The Republican Party sends out imitations of Nancy Pelosi in emails to people. So a gullible reader will say, oh, I got an email from Nancy Pelosi. It looks like it's coming from her, but it's not her. It's the Republican Party, which is sending out an email to make Nancy Pelosi look foolish. It's satire. It's part of our culture. It's not very strong satire, but satire.
Yeah. So was anybody actually fooled by your Gmail emails into believing that they were actually sent by Schiffman? And if so, would that not support a criminal charge rather than a parody defense? And why or why not?
Well, first of all, I don't know if anybody was fooled or not. Dr. Schiffman testified that a student came up to him asking him about the email. Does that mean that he got his email, or that he really thought he got his email, or was it just his manner of approaching him with it? So he didn't testify.
Yes.
None of the people, except for those two deans who did not take it seriously.
Yeah.
None of the people who received this testified. I wonder why not. So the other question was, should that be the grounds for
a criminal charge? If in fact they believed that it was actually sent by Schiffman?
Certainly not, because people are fooled by satire all the time. So you want to take the slippery slope into saying, well, if you write an unsuccessful satire, whenever you write a satire, you're taking a risk. What if somebody's fooled by it? You'll be charged with a crime. So that's going to chill satire. That's what the First Amendment is all about. It's about chilling speech, right? So if you discourage people from writing satire by saying, oh, you're taking a risk here, you got to make it clear to people that it's a satire, otherwise they might be fooled, and then we're going to treat it as a hoax and not a satire. No, 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 no. Satire and hoaxes always blend together. There's always an element of hoax in a strong satire. That's just the way it is historically. So they say, I don't understand the genre of satire. Believe me, I have a PhD in comparative literature. I understand the genre of satire.
One would hope.
Yeah.
So you indicate in your book that people have often been fooled by satire. How has the emergence of the internet medium impacted on this phenomenon?
Let's take a step back from the internet. Towards the end of the 15th century, or I don't remember the exact date, but something was invented that's called the printing press. before that time, when people wrote letters, they put them in they had to deliver them somehow. There was a service of some sort that they would send a letter and it would get sent to somebody else who would eventually receive it. And then something was invented called the printing press, which changed, it was a new medium, the way the internet is a new medium today. It changed the entire relationship between us and knowledge, how knowledge became distributed between people. And lo and behold, soon after the printing press was invented, a book started going around called Letters of Obscure Men. And this is one of the most famous satires ever written. And he took advantage of the fact that there was the printing press. We still don't know who the author was, although there are theories about who he might have been. And this was distributed all over Europe because it was printed out by presses and distributed that way. And not a manuscript. It's difficult to copy a manuscript. It takes a long time. You have one manuscript. With the printing press, you can print out 5,000 things and you send it out to readers everywhere, right? So many people believed when they were reading these letters that they were authentic letters that they were reading. Monks in monasteries around Europe, they thought they were reading actual letters. So that's part of the history of satire. It's one of the most famous satires ever written, and it was banned by the Pope under pain of excommunication. If you were found with a copy of that book, you would be excommunicated. It was seen as a very serious threat by the Catholic Church because the people who were mocked in that book they were church officials who were saying that the books of the Jews should be burned. So you see the anti-Semitism and the response to anti-Semitism taking the form of a satire, a famous satire. We owe the word obscurantism to the Letters of Obscure Men, a very important text. Now let's go forward. We have a new invention called the internet. So this is a new medium which makes it even easier to distribute thoughts, opinions, facts, debates, satire. So one can reflect about that and what it means for satire, and to have people, if people get an email, do they automatically believe that it's coming from who it says it's coming from, even if there's something strange about it, if it doesn't read like that person would have it read? Incidentally, these emails did not come from Dr. Schiffman's email, right? They came from an address that I invented with using what I gave him a nickname. I didn't realize that it actually was his nickname. I gave him the nickname Larry. So.
And it came from a Gmail account
rather
than
from his
NYU account.
Yeah, not from an NYU account.
Yeah.
So to me, it was clear that there might be a bit of initial confusion. There was a link in the email to the article that I had posted about this issue of what to me seems to be plagiarism and Avi Katzman's allegations, the whole history of that. I published an article about it online. And that was prominently featured in the email. The email sends people to the article, and it also, incidentally, it instructs the recipients that you are not to speak about this matter to students. What department chairman would send around a Gmail to his colleagues saying you are not to speak about this to students? That's a completely absurd thing. Nobody would say such a thing. Maybe the university system in America has changed to such a point that today that would be seen as a perfectly normal thing. Yes, we must not speak about this to students.
Yeah, if you're going to exclude students from information, you do that privately in a conversation rather than in an email.
What everything kind of nonsense is that?
Kept on record that way.
So people recognize this as sharp academic humor. I don't know if it was good humor or stupid humor or what, but the intention was clearly to draw attention to the articles that I attached to the email. It was clickbait, if you want, satirical clickbait.
Yes. So how do your actions resemble or differ from well-known Twitter campaigns impersonating various university presidents, none of which were subjected to criminal prosecutions?
The difference is that they're using Twitter and that they're university presidents, not university department chairmen. So is a department chairman more privileged than a president? To me, that's a matter of opinion. So
This is basically the same thing, in essence.
well, some people might say, well, a university president, that's something else. That's a public matter. A department chairman, oh, that's a private matter. I don't think so. I don't think questions of academic misconduct are private matters. And incidentally, there was a former NYU dean who is now the president of Haifa University, or he was at least for a long time. I don't know if today he still is. But he wrote a whole book about these kind of things long before I did my satire. And he said that he praised the emails that were going around academic departments from members of the public, angry emails complaining about things. He said, this is good. It shows that the public is concerned with what's going on in the academic community. And then he also praised hoaxes that were engaged in by academics against each other. He said that a hoax is just normal. It's a better way of calling attention to your idea. He thought this was great. So, of course, he didn't say anything about what was going on when I got arrested. So.
Different strokes for different folks, as they say. So what responsibility, if any, do lesser-known satirists and parodists have to make it clear that they are, in fact, engaging in such acts of satire or parody, whereas well-known figures like Stephen Colbert and Sacha Baron Cohen are presumed to be making things up? So when you send out something that's satirical, how is that different, and what responsibility do you have that's different from those more well-known satirists?
Well, I don't agree with the whole premise of this question. Satire is satire. Most satire has been published anonymously through the centuries. So you have no responsibility. If you're publishing something anonymously, you don't have a responsibility to say, this is a satire and I'm the person publishing. It's done anonymously. So this argument about anonymity and saying who you are, this is a whole tendency in America. I call it the new honesty. It's been going on for a long time. But this goes back centuries. There's a famous incident in the 18th century. Rousseau, the great French philosopher, among other things, he was a philosopher of education. He wrote a very important treatise on education. And Rousseau, he abandoned his children in an orphanage, all of them. And this was exposed in a letter that was published, like a letter to the public that was published by an anonymous person. Saying Rousseau abandoned this person, Rousseau, that everybody thinks is a great philosopher of education. He abandoned his children. And as a result, Rousseau was stoned by people when he went to visit a city somewhere. People were like disgusted at what he had done. He said, I read his book. I thought he was such a wonderful expert on children. He abandoned his children in an orphanage. What a horrible thing to do. And in Rousseau's Confessions, he discusses this, and he says, it's true, he confesses. I abandoned my children. He tries to explain why he did it. He just didn't think he would be a good father for them. And then he says, but what I was really upset by was that the person who did this did it anonymously. He didn't have the courage to put his face to it. So he tried to attack the person who did it. Well, we know today that the person who did this was Voltaire, another great philosopher, right? But he concealed his identity at the time, and so Rousseau used that to attack him. So this debate about anonymity has been going on for years. People saying, oh, you mustn't be anonymous, you must say who you are, that's honest, right? If you're dishonest by concealing your identity. That's a form of dishonesty, right? And then we're not going to take your ideas as seriously.
So
But
what I was getting at,
that's ridiculous. What you do when you're presenting something anonymously is you're saying, what I want you to pay attention to is my message, not me, the messenger, but look at the content of what I'm saying, the message. That's why it's anonymous.
so what I was getting at before about the well-known satirists like Sacha Baron Cohen and so forth, why can they get away with these sort of satirical and parodistic kinds of communications, even if they're done anonymously, even if they're sometimes as hoaxes? Why do they get away with it and you didn't?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, do you think that somebody who's well-known should automatically get away with it, whereas somebody who's less well-known should be prosecuted criminally?
Well, that's not the way the law works.
Right.
If I get prosecuted for it, they should be prosecuted for it as well. If it really is a crime, but should anybody be prosecuted for that? That's the real question here.
Right. Exactly. So how do you answer those who say that sending out false confessions of wrongdoing is not satire? Are similar satirical parodies and hoaxes by, for example, the group known as the Yes Men, considered by the courts to be protected speech under the First Amendment?
Well, are the Yes Men considered protected speech? We don't know. They haven't been charged with a crime. There's been no case. The other question was...
Well, so, if you're sending out a false confession of wrongdoing, some people say that that's not satire.
Well, all satire involves false confessions of wrongdoing. That's the nature of satire. Maybe not all satire. I take that back. But a great deal of satire involves precisely false confessions of wrongdoing. Yep. That's the whole point.
Right.
Satire is not engaged in by people just for a good laugh. Even the satire on late night TV, if you analyze the things that are being said, you'll find confessions of wrongdoing embedded in it, right? So the question is whether the fact that your name is not appended to it, that's the issue. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. So Arthur Hayes, who's a media law specialist at Fordham, said, quote, "Parody, satire, and other forms of outrageous speech have the capacity to reveal truths that provide valuable information and wisdom about the human condition that may yield great benefit to substantial portions of any community." Can you comment on Hayes' statement?
Well, what I'll point out is that Hayes also recognized my emails as satire. He specifically said this. So yes, I agree with everything he says. But the judges when the case finally came down to this one little thing of the satires, the judges at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, they said, well, somebody has to recognize it as a satire. At least one person. Arthur Hayes, a media specialist, he recognizes it as a satire. So I would suggest that if they really think that I don't understand the genre of satire, read my book, read my section on satire, and then see if you still feel that I don't understand the genre.
Right. So you cite a number of historical precedents for the use of anonymity and pseudonyms in satirical writings intended to criticize the powerful, including the satires of our own founding father, Benjamin Franklin, among others. How do you view your own efforts in the context of these precedents, and why shouldn't such actions, if they harm or embarrass others, be punished, especially if they appear to be written under the so-called victim's own name?
Okay, well, we've been talking about most of the things that you asked there. Well, first of all, how my stuff fits in. I wouldn't say that my stuff fits in with that. What I would say is that to understand satire, you need to study the history of satire. So to recognize satirical text, maybe we've come down to the spot where people in the United States have a difficulty understanding irony or satire when they see it in written form, and so people are becoming more gullible. Perhaps that could be an educational problem that we have to deal with in the country. So that's my comment on how what I did
where you
fits
fit in.
where I fit in with that. Then you asked if it should be
Punished if it embarrasses people, or
well, satire always embarrasses people. Satire always hurts somebody's reputation. It's always designed to embarrass somebody. That's the whole point of satire. Some of the greatest satires of history were excruciatingly embarrassing to their so-called victims, which is not exactly a word that I approve of, but
I
that
use
I
that in
agree
quotes.
with.
That's
It's not
why.
exactly a word I agree with, but anyway, one of the greatest a hoax that was engaged in by Jonathan Swift, great satirist. The same hoax was engaged in by Benjamin Franklin. They both did variations on this hoax, and they were of a satirical nature. And what they did is they announced that a certain person was going to die on a certain date. And what they were really interested in was the ideas of the person in question. The hoax by Jonathan Swift, his victim was a person who foretold the future, right? So in like horoscopes, right? So he said, I've read a horoscope. It says he's going to die on a certain date. And then the date passed, and then Swift came out with another article saying that he had died because the date had passed. And so the guy said, no, I'm still very much alive. And then he became the victim of jokes all the time, people poking fun at him because, no, you say you're alive, but you're dead. And then Benjamin Franklin did the same thing. And as a matter of fact, the first parody known in history, it said that the so-called victim of the parody, this was in ancient Greece, committed suicide. So yeah, satire can be very deeply embarrassing. That's the nature of satire, and I'm sorry about that, but that's so. Satire is not a beloved form, and that might be why people are falling out of touch with it, why it's being taught less and less. People like to teach classes on things that students are going to enjoy, right? But there's something about satire that people don't like. But that's what the First Amendment is always about. The First Amendment isn't about protecting speech that people like. It's about protecting speech that people don't like. That's the issue here.
Now let's talk a little bit about your actual prosecution and the First Amendment issues it raises. Your book opens with a dramatic account of your arrest at gunpoint in your apartment in the early hours of the morning by a policeman who told you that it was about your computer and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do we know anything about how NYU professor Lawrence Schiffman managed to get the authorities to be interested in pursuing a criminal case against you, which stemmed from an academic dispute? Why would the authorities be interested in prosecuting someone over a nonviolent academic matter? And I want to read a little quote from the New York Times article from 2013 by John Leland, in which Schiffman said, quote, "You know how the FBI says, once you're one of ours, you're always one of ours. It's totally true." And then Schiffman said, "Send some police in there to scare him and he'll stop." Can you comment on that?
Well, first of all, that article by John Leland has all kinds of things in it that I purportedly said, which I didn't. So you'll have to ask Dr. Schiffman. Maybe he didn't even say that. Your other question, why prosecutors would be interested in making this into a criminal case, well, again, you'll have to ask them. There could be many different reasons, but the broadest reason of course, would be that they're interested in cases that enable them to expand the reach of the criminal law. They're always trying to do that. And there's a whole movement in the United States today to try and limit the scope of the First Amendment. So that's how this needs to be seen, as part of that movement.
So the fact that you sent your email from a Gmail address and signed it Larry Schiffman, among other things, conveyed the sense to colleagues at NYU that Schiffman didn't write it, thus effectively eliminating any real harm caused by your actions. So why do you think the prosecution went forward with the charges anyway?
This case was not just about one email. What the prosecution did in this case, they criminalized my entire campaign. Everything. So you have to look at it that way.
So you were charged with, amongst other things, identity theft. When people think of identity theft, they think of stealing personal information needed to open a credit card or other accounts used to obtain goods or services. But you were charged with trying to obtain unspecified benefits, advantages, or gains. Was the nature of such proceeds of your crimes ever spelled out by the prosecutor, victims, or judge?
Well, first of all, Howard, these identity theft charges were thrown out. We're talking about something that was done in violation of my rights. That's why they were thrown out. Not just a little technicality, but this involved my 14th Amendment rights, right, to due process. So those charges did not apply to this kind of situation. They were trying to fit the circumstances of this case into statutes that were obviously written for something totally different. What this involved was the prosecution's effort to overcharge me with like dozens upon dozens of crimes, right? And as serious as possible, to try and damage me as much as possible, to try and convince the jury that I was a serious criminal. I even committed felony identity theft. You see, that's much worse than these little misdemeanors. So, identity theft. The jury ends up thinking, oh, this is serious. Oh, you really did something serious.
So in the end, these charges were thrown out because they really should have only applied in cases where you were actually doing the kinds of things I described before, stealing somebody's credit card information and all those other sorts of activities.
Things like that, yeah.
Yes, that's kind of what I thought. So you were in essence charged with the kind of crimes that are normally reserved for financial fraudsters who obtained a financial benefit or caused financial harm. What possible benefit could you have expected to have received by posting online or sending emails in the name of various individuals, or does the nature of the benefit matter in the eyes of the law? And would causing embarrassment, even if it involved having uncomfortable truth revealed, be considered to be harm under the law?
There's benefit and there's harm, right? So the benefit at trial, just anything. So in other words, if I felt good, that's a benefit. If I wanted to score a point in a debate, that's a benefit, right? So and then when it went up to the Court of Appeals, the intermediary court just didn't do anything, right? Somehow they imagined that all of this was okay. And then it goes up to the Court of Appeals, and they agreed with us that that could not be a benefit, right? So then they focused in on the harm area, and they said, well, we agree that normally the harm has to be financial, but we're going to create an exception where you harm somebody's reputation. Now, at the trial, the judge had said that libel, defamation, is no longer a crime, so the truth is not a defense, she said. The truth is not a defense to any of the charges. So, in other words, I was subjected to a trial for defamation, alleged defamation, at which I was not allowed to plead the truth. And that's a violation of defamation law. So they did an end run around the First Amendment right there. There's a famous case, New York Times v. Sullivan. And that's what they're trying, that's the case, that's the key case in First Amendment law. And there's a whole movement across the United States over the past 10 years at least to try and get rid of New York Times v. Sullivan. Very important issue going on. And that they did that already before this movement started. They did that with my case. So very serious matter here.
So you were also charged with harassment. And what happened with your case that caused the New York State harassment law to be overturned on First Amendment grounds? Can you explain a little bit about that?
The case was appealed. So eventually they were forced to confront New York's aggravated harassment law, which civil rights lawyers had been trying to get declared unconstitutional for at least 3 or 4 decades, right? And a federal court had already declared that this statute was unconstitutional. They used it against me anyway. So it gets up to the New York Court of Appeals, and they did the right thing. They did what they had to do. They said this statute is unconstitutional. 7,000 pending cases had to be thrown out, according to one newspaper. And, it's a serious matter. The 7,000 people were awaiting charges in New York under an unconstitutional statute. That gives you a little insight into some of the things that are going on in the criminal justice world in the United States, that this thing was allowed to stand for so many years, and then finally, thanks to me, it gets declared unconstitutional. And then, are people talking about that? Of course not. They didn't even say a word about it afterwards. You find maybe a little footnote in the law review article here or there. This is a major issue. For 40 years, maybe 50 years, that thing was there on the books, sending people to jail under an unconstitutional statute in violation of their First Amendment rights. That's a scandal.
It certainly is. I mean, this is a really big deal, as they say. So you alluded to this a bit before. Libel is normally a civil matter, not a criminal matter. But you've said that this was, in effect, a criminal libel case. How did your case, whereby you were accused of sullying the reputations of your so-called victims, represent an end run around civil libel laws? If one goes around making false statements about someone, couldn't that also be considered to be harassment? And why shouldn't libel be criminalized?
Okay, 2 questions there. One is libel, the other is harassment, different issues. So libel, after the famous Sullivan decision, the Supreme Court came out with other decisions, and they said that if you have criminal libel charges, the truth must be a defense, the same thing as in the civil libel charges, right? Now, in New York is one of the majority of American states that after the Sullivan decision and after those decisions about criminal libel in the early 1960s, they removed criminal libel from their books. That's why the judge said libel's no longer a crime in New York, so truth is not a defense. That's how they got around it. It was like an end run around the First Amendment. They accused me over and over again through this trial of having made false accusations against people, right? Saying that they engaged in misconduct, they did this and that. And so my accusations were not false, but I was not allowed to prove that they were true. So that way they made this into a character thing about me, saying, this guy who makes false accusations, you see, he's a horrible person. He makes false accusations. He must have committed crimes. He's lying, right? But I wasn't allowed to show that these accusations were true because the truth was not a defense. So that's how they get around that. And the result is an assault against my character, an assault against the truth, which is much worse than an assault against my character. Prosecutors are not supposed to be doing that kind of thing. There's a whole division of the prosecutor's office in New York where they examine this kind of thing in case they re-examine their cases to see if everything was okay. Of course, this one they didn't re-examine, but it's a problem because they have certain ideals that they claim to adhere to, that they're there for justice, not just to get somebody convicted, but for justice. And if they feel that there was something wrong in a trial, then they'll re-examine it and they'll re-examine the decision to charge somebody. In this trial, it was the opposite. He did anything he could just to win. He didn't care about justice. Yeah. It was so obvious. The truth is not a defense. And he starts saying, and these accusations were these false accusations, these false. So he knew he could get away with it because the judge, she wouldn't allow us to demonstrate the truth of my accusations.
Sounds thoroughly Kafkaesque.
So libel says that the accusation has to be intentionally false. for libel, right? Criminal libel or civil libel.
carelessly false, or recklessly false.
Recklessly or intentionally false, right? So you have to prove that the person did it intentionally or recklessly, right? There was no such proof at my trial. That's where the standard was violated,
Yeah.
right? They said it was false. Well, I say it's true. They said it was false. Maybe they could prove that it's false somehow, but I certainly believed that it was true. I wasn't being reckless. I examined the facts, right? So
Yep. Being wrong isn't necessarily an issue in and of itself. It's whether you were reckless in the way that you approached the issue.
Well, is it reckless to send a satire? That makes no sense at all.
So the prosecution accused you of the crime of harassment by sending messages that were intended to annoy alleged victims.
Right.
If your victims felt annoyed by your emails about them, but not generally to them, about them, should that constitute a crime? And if not, where should the line be drawn between messages that are annoying and ones that constitute actual harassment?
Whether it should be is a philosophical question. But courts, there's the facts, whether it is, right? Not whether it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Courts around the United States have decided in various cases that no, writing things about somebody, saying things about somebody is not harassment. That's what they tried and get around the First Amendment by saying it was indirect harassment, right? He's harassing him indirectly by talking to other people about him. No, you're confusing harassment with defamation, right? So in other words, you can't use harassment charges to try and get around New York Times v. Sullivan. That's what it's all about.
Yes. So you mentioned they offered you a plea deal. Why didn't you take it?
Well, for many reasons, but first and foremost, I believe in justice. I believe in the truth. And these charges were outrageous. They wanted me to plead guilty to a statute that's unconstitutional. If I had pled guilty, thousands of people would have been, that year, thousands of people would have been charged with harassment in New York.
Yeah. So it wasn't just about you then. Yeah.
No. There's another reason as well. I found out early on, it was in the newspapers, that Dr. Schiffman had written a response to the allegations of plagiarism. And I knew that the only way that that response would become a public document, because it was a secret thing that he had sent to people at NYU, but I knew that he must have sent it to the prosecutor as well. And I said to myself, the only way that's going to become a public document is if I go to trial. And it turned out that it did become a public document at my trial, and which enabled my father then to respond to that publicly on the University of Chicago website. So what I did going through that trial, it contributed to this whole discussion concerning the Dead Sea Scrolls and academic conduct and misconduct.
Yes, that's remarkably courageous of you to put yourself in that position
It had
for
to be done.
for that purpose. And
It had to be done.
Commendable. Yes.
It just had to be done.
Yes, I understand. So how did the prosecution go about attacking your free speech rights and your character?
Oh, well, they removed everything from context, right? So they have these people come on there and say, oh, false accusations, and all of the problems about the Dead Sea Scrolls were distorted and eliminated, right? This is just, they presented me as somebody coming on there making outrageous accusations about people. They've eliminated the whole context. These are people trying to defend a theory for many years now that has been refuted. They're in a very difficult position. They're desperate to defend this theory. Now that's the context, and that's not the way this was presented. So it puts me in a terrible light because I was trying to expose the truth. And they're just saying, this guy is, look what he's doing. They would look at my language and some correspondence between me and my brother, for example. I sometimes I had a bantering tone. They focused in on certain words I used. They said, look, he uses this word. It shows his aggression. Said they must know. I said at one point to my brother, they must know that there's somebody out there who's intent on on getting them or on exposing them. And, you know, so they say, you see, he says he's going to get them. Look at that! What a criminal! He's going to get them.
You were going to get them by
and they
exposing
say,
the truth.
They say that
That's
this
how you
has
would get
nothing.
them.
They say that this has nothing to do with the First Amendment. But when you look at somebody's language, say, look, he says this and he says that. They're interpreting my words. They're taking them out of context. That's what the First Amendment is all about. It's all about language. They're looking at the content of my speech. And they're evaluating the content of my speech and saying, this is not satire. We're not going to accept that this is satire. That in itself violates the whole spirit of the First Amendment. Somebody comes up and says, this was a satire. And they say, we're not going to accept that because people didn't believe it was a satire. This was about the First Amendment.
So I noticed that they said you were a menace because of your intellectual training. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, somebody with an intellectual background is always a menace to authoritarian figures. So naturally they say that I'm a menace. But by the way, did we say before that the harassment statute is about annoying people and that this is the reason it was thrown out? Because it's not a crime to annoy people. We annoy people all the time. Newspaper articles about people annoy people. If it's a crime to annoy people, journalists would be sitting in Rikers Island right now. It's not a crime to annoy people in the United States of America. That was the problem with the harassment statute.
So all of this was done in a spectacular, highly publicized manner, wasn't it?
Well, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls is a spectacle, and my trial became a spectacle. And the whole thing about the trial is, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It became part of the Dead Sea Scrolls spectacle, and it enabled them to try and make a spectacle, a bad spectacle of the resistance to their theory, right? Say, there are these people. See, the idea was to try and smear my father by saying, look what his son did. So yeah, it's just part of a very sordid practice that's emerged over the years with the Dead Sea Scrolls of making them into a spectacle. And with no serious discussion of any of these issues that we've been talking about that emerged during the trial. No serious discussion of the First Amendment. The newspapers weren't interested in that. All they were interested in was the spectacle.
So what role did the media play in supporting the prosecution's narrative of the case? And why do you think they generally took the prosecution's side?
Well, they do that regularly. They have their offices right down the hallway from the prosecutor. He comes out in the hallway, he gives them a little speech, and then they go with that. And they decided early on, as part of their spectacle, they decided that that this case, they would package this case in a certain way. People are upset about the internet, about all kinds of things going on the internet, so they would use me, it's a little bit of scapegoating. They would use me as the criminal. You see, now it's a crime to do these things. So that they just decided to go with that narrative, with that story. And that's how the media is. So I have the greatest respect for the New York Times. It's an important institution, but sometimes they don't do the right thing. And this was such a case. It's a terrible shame because it's their rights at stake as well as mine.
Yes.
It's the First Amendment.
So what about the public reaction to your trial? What was that like?
Well, as I was saying, the public, they have legitimate reasons for being upset about a lot of the stuff that goes on online, right? So there's always a little bit of truth on the other side of the mirror when you're in that strange world of the alternative truths, right? There's always a little bit of truth there that explains it, right? So people are legitimately upset about the healthcare system in the United States, right? And to go from there to saying that vaccinations are part of a plot to kill people, then you're crossing the line into just like complete nonsense, right? But you got to understand, people have a legitimate reason to be upset about lots of things, and so yeah, there many things are wrong with what's going on the internet, and people, if you're feeling a little upset about the internet, about internet culture, and if you're feeling that there's something missing from your lives, read my book. It will give you some insight into these problems and how they evolve over time.
You were briefly incarcerated at Rikers Island. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like there?
Well, I would refer readers to my book for that one, Howard. That's a long story, and that was after the trial. She said she wanted to sentence me to 6 months at Rikers Island. Eventually, it was dropped by the judge that came in years later, who must have realized what was going on here and just dropped the sentence entirely. So,
So you were initially...
my night at Rikers, I have a whole section in the book about that, describing it. What's going on in that place is a scandal. It's an outrage. And that place needs to be shut down. So I've documented in my book. I would hope that more people would be talking about it.
Yes. So you were initially convicted at trial of 31 misdemeanors and felonies. You then appealed these convictions. How many of your convictions were overturned on appeal?
Howard, I'm not good at math. I don't look at things that way. When it came down to the nitty-gritty at the end, there were six complainants at the beginning. One after another, they all get eliminated except for one person at New York University. The others were all in different states, incidentally, right? So we end up just with one person at New York University, an influential, important person looked up to in New York, and we're just left with that little batch of emails, right? So they treated each one of them as a separate crime, as a separate email, right? When it was all just one incident that took place in like a little string of things I sent out over like one day, like a period of 24 hours, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, when I arrived at Rikers, by the way, the guy asked me, how many crimes did you commit? And I said, one. Because in my mind it was just all one thing. And,
sure.
And so, you know, so I don't think that way.
Yeah.
It's,
well, I'm pretty good about math, and so as I understand it, there were 21 of the charges that were thrown out, and there were a remaining 10 Schiffman email convictions that stood. 21 of them were vacated.
Well,
what was the final outcome?
There were 5 emails. 5 emails were sent. 2 emails to the deans, 1 email to the provost, 1 email to the student newspaper, and the 5th one to his graduate teaching assistants, right? So each one of them becomes a separate crime, but they were all sent at the same time, right? So you got to realize how it works.
Anyway, the point is that you had some remaining charges, and 21 of these charges were vacated. So what was the outcome at sentencing by Judge Ward, the final outcome?
Judge Ward dropped the sentence. Right. So she said, time served. What was she going to do?
Time served.
So what was going to do? That night at Rikers, it was still, I had been there, so that was the natural thing for her to do. And you should have seen the expression on the prosecutor's face of like shock that she was not giving them what they wanted. They wanted to send me to jail for 4 months. And she just said, I'm going to let him go. She said, coming here so many times over all these years, the prosecution at that point, they didn't even know what the case was about anymore. They kept on sending new people who didn't have any idea, didn't have any clue. I kept on showing up over all those years in Judge Ward's court. She pleaded with me not to come at a certain point anymore. She said, please just stay home until this is all over. But, you know, I kept on going there. And the prosecutors weren't even showing up. They didn't care about this case anymore. Once the guy got the conviction, and then the other guy who appealed the case with these strange arguments, once that was done, they'd done their job, and the rest they couldn't care less about.
Yeah. So I recall that you mentioned in your book that one of the scholars that you criticized asserted that you were a conspiracy theorist. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, that's just a way of saying that my allegations of misconduct were false, because there are such things as conspiracies, right? There are conspiracies dealing with the cost of medicine and things like that. There are actual conspiracies that are documented all the time. There are cases about conspiracies, and their conspiracies are revealed in the newspapers. So there's a difference between actual conspiracies and the conspiracies that conspiracy theorists are saying, right? So they're saying that I'm a conspiracy theorist. Now, I never said that there was a conspiracy to begin with, right? So that's just a way on their part of saying that I'm saying false things. But if you want to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what do you call it when the people who are putting on a museum exhibit get together in a room, and maybe people in other museums that we don't know, but people in a museum get together and they agree not to mention the name of a professor who disagrees with the theory. Is that a conspiracy among them to do something that's not appropriate, or is it not? It's a question of opinion. So if you want to find conspiracies dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you certainly can, and you would have a legitimate argument that there are conspiracies. But I never said that to begin with. So
Conspiracy only takes two people.
well, there you have it.
So Adam Smith once said, people of the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. Can you care to comment a little bit about that?
Well, I guess Adam Smith must have been a conspiracy theorist then.
Yeah.
Well, there's a difference. What he's saying is true, right? So Adam Smith was pointing out that people, they'll get together to preserve their power and to make the merchandise that they're selling worth more money. And that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls is all about, incidentally. It's about money. They're merchandise, right? They're being marketed through the media, through advertising campaigns, through museum exhibits, through tourism. It's all about money.
So speaking of conspiracies, a new book by David Enrich of the New York Times is entitled Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. The book is described as an in-depth expose of the broad campaign to silence dissent and protect the powerful. Do you see any connection between Enrich's book, the Dead Sea Scrolls controversy, and your trial?
Well, certainly. I wish I had his title for mine, Murder the Truth. That's a great title, huh? So, Murder the Truth, it's an excellent book about this whole tendency over the past 10 years or so to try and get rid of the fundamental standard in New York Times v. Sullivan that you have to show that somebody intentionally or recklessly lied about somebody, about a public figure, to have him found liable for defamation. So it's about that. But the problem with this book and a lot of the reporting on this issue is that the real problem is broader than Enrich would like to make it seem. He's focusing in on this one thing of New York Times v. Sullivan. But that emerged out of a broader tendency in the United States to try and damage the First Amendment, to try and limit its scope. And so my case is relevant to that, but there were other cases as well that you can find where the resurgence of criminal libel across the United States, in many of the states where they still have those statutes, those cases are atrocious. They send people to jail for saying something about a public figure. Absolutely atrocious.
Well, fortunately, we don't live in those states. So you were charged with crimes for disseminating information that is of public concern, something that the First Amendment protects. What do you think the impact of charging whistleblowers with crimes could be?
Well, whistleblowers, that's an interesting question that you ask, because whistleblowers, nobody likes a whistleblower. People hate whistleblowers, especially in the academic community, because people have this natural respect for professorial figures. And that respect is exploited by the Bible pundits who go on television and talking like the great experts about the Bible and about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and who are often saying things for which there's no evidence at all. I mean, they don't really come out and be straightforward about this and say, I have no evidence for this, but one possibility could be, I'm just speculating here. They don't say, I'm just speculating. They say, well, I believe, it's rubbish. And because they have this veneer of respectability, people, they're fascinated by this. So those are like the ancient priestly figures, right? They've become modern professors. And when it comes down to whistleblowers, there's a natural, especially in a context like that, people are very upset. They're saying things about this person who I revere.
The impact of charging whistleblowers with actual crimes, what's the impact on the First Amendment of doing that?
It's one thing not to like people, and it's another thing to charge them with crimes, right? So if you charge whistleblowers with crimes, juries are going to convict them because people don't like whistleblowers, and the members of the juries are not going to like the whistleblowers. The whistleblowers are going to be convicted. And then you're chilling. People are going to be afraid to engage in whistleblowing. And like them or not, whistleblowing is part of our society. It's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
did your prosecution end up serving the interests of the defenders of the sectarian theory? And if so, how and why?
well, it's always about defending the interests of the powerful, right? That's what whistleblowers don't do. They don't whistleblow about any old thing. They whistleblow about people who are in positions of power. And that's what this is all about. People, public figures, people in positions who have influence, who have power, right? An academic department chairman, he has power, he has influence over students, but also his voice, he speaks, right? People listen to him because they read that, oh, he's an academic department chairman. Then somehow he becomes the editor of the encyclopedia. Things work like that in the academic world. So it's always about defending people in positions of power. And I don't remember your question.
I think you answered the question. So the sheer harrowing nature of your arrest at gunpoint, your experience in the tombs awaiting arraignment, and your subsequent stint at Rikers, which you describe in such vivid detail in your book. It's astonishing that you've taken this in your stride and you've retained your sense of humor. You want to comment a little bit about that?
It's just my way of resisting. They want to get to you. They want to destroy you. So you have to be cool. It's the only way. What can I say? I'm glad I went through the thing because we got that aggravated harassment statute declared unconstitutional. We got that secret document from NYU published. So it's important. It had to be done.
Okay, just a few final questions. In what way do you consider the case against you to have revealed the fragility of the First Amendment?
It's not just my case, but a lot of things happening these days. Our whole system of law depends on the willingness of those who are responsible for the system to enforce the system properly. In the United States, we have a two-tier system. You have all these lower courts, and then you have the appeals process that goes up to the higher courts. Those are two totally separate universes. So the media, what they're interested in is what goes on in the trial, right? That's, a trial, right? So the trial became a spectacle, and then you get this appeals process that goes on over the years, and gradually the media just loses its interest in this, right? Who cares about these little technical details, right? And this was even the attitude of the trial judge, incidentally. She said, we don't have to examine the First Amendment now, right? We don't have to examine that now. What she meant is you can do that on appeal. Look, for me, it was one thing. I had a training that allowed me to get through it fine, and I had my principles, and I knew that I was fighting for justice. But for other people, it could be much more serious. So yeah, it's a serious problem. And it all depends on the willingness to follow the law. If people just lose their respect for the legal system and just say, we're not going to do it, even if you're the government, we're not going to do that. If okay, the Court of Appeals reminded us that that's the law, but sorry, too late. That ain't right, and it won't work in the long run. It's a sign of a decline in our legal culture, and it might still be semi-functional today. So many people might disagree with me even about that, whether it's semi-functional. But wait another 50 years, another 100 years, if these problems are not fixed, we're going to be in a terrible situation.
Yes. So throughout your legal ordeal and in your book, you emphasize the importance of truth. Why is truth so important to you in the context of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship? And how does that relate to the state of truth in our current society?
Well, truth is always important. It's not only important with respect to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Truth is, our whole world depends on the truth. It's a fundamental value. Science depends on the truth.
Yeah. So after all you've been through with your criminal case, was it worth it to go to trial and through all of the stages of appeals?
I did what I had to do.
Well, so obviously you did what you had to do, and you feel like you did what you had to do. So in that sense, it must have been worth it.
I did my duty.
Yes. So what would you say to a reader who simply feels that they have no interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or in the history of satire, or in the details of the First Amendment? Why should they read your book?
Well, I think there's one thing that you left off that list, which is something that everybody can be interested in, and that's power. And I think all of us have a shared interest in our ability to expose misconduct, to tell truth to power. And that's something that everybody can learn about from reading my book, and how people in positions of power try and suppress others who are in our country who are trying to tell truth to power. That's an important issue. And even if you're not interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you might get a little more interested in them if you give it a try.
Absolutely. So where can viewers find out more information about your book and your legal case?
RaphaelGolb.com. You'll find everything about the book right there.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like our viewers to know before we end our interview today?
I hope that people can synthesize this in their minds into just one clear set of issues. The truth, the freedom of debate in this country, and power, and telling truth to power. That's what this is all about. And the issue of the Dead Sea Scrolls is an important one. It's about where we came from. And when power is abused to make an old and largely debunked theory about the Dead Sea Scrolls seem as if it's just a fact of daily life, you got a big problem. It's not good. Something has to be done about it.
So I want to thank you so much, Raphael, for sharing your ideas and experiences with PKRG-TV viewers. It's been fascinating and an enlightening discussion for me. And I want to thank our viewers for watching this program on PKRG-TV, where there's something for everyone.